if a brand is going to be considered important and grow across communities or across cultures or across continents, we get to a place where we're talking about scale. And the cannabis industry is really built not for scale.
Getting bud to bloom. The cannabis sector needs little persuasion when it comes to embracing edginess and innovation. But building a brand in an emerging market category takes some serious upward punching. Veteran brand marketer and author of Branding Bud, David Paleschuck, needs little introduction to the global cannabis fam. He tells us more about the challenges and opportunities weed brands face as they figure out the way forward.
And we are live, and welcome to the Lobsterpot podcast. I'm Dave Barton. I'm one of the co-founders of this podcast and of Thermidor, a content creative agency specializing in cannabis. Got to put that there, haven't I, Jamie? Who's the other host here? Hello, sir. How are you?
Hello, sir. I'm very good, thank you. Very good. Excited for our guest today.
Yeah,
you know, it's feels very much kind of kindred spirity in terms of conversation. So yeah, excited to get into it.
Well, yeah, no, absolutely. I think because of course there is the book, just to give our viewers out there a little clue. And I think when you see the background of our guest today is, of course, David Paleschuck, who is the author of Branding Bud, a book about cannabis branding and marketing, podcaster extraordinaire in his own right, and just all-around good chap from what we can tell thus far. So good to see you, David. How you doing?
Hi, Dave. Hi, Jamie. How are you?
We're all right, you know. I do like the kind of on-brand sort of yellowness. Is it just because it's a joyful color, isn't it? This is why have you sort of gone with the yellow? I have to, because it is quite a sort of consistent theme for the Branding Bud brand.
It is. I think it's more than anything a reaction to the green and blues of the cannabis industry, of more of the past. But for sure, there was a time and a place where probably 90% of the cannabis brands were blue and green and had a cannabis leaf. So I was looking for a way to offset that and sort of stand out. And now it's funny, you know, I even get comments on LinkedIn that people say anytime I see something yellow, I know it's you, which is awesome. But I've seen a lot of new folks also using yellow too all of a sudden over the past, let's say, 6 to 8 months. So,
so you know,
my color over time.
That's it. You're setting the trend rather than following it, though, and that's good. But no, I hear you completely around the kind of canna branding, canna this, canna that, and it's kind of annoying. See what I did there? And yeah, I think that's kind of our thinking with Thermidor. It was just more about, you know, having a nod to that sort of thought. I mean, we've obviously gone for the greenness, but something that is reminiscent but is not immediately obvious. But it's cool. But yeah, tell us a little bit, for those 5 people who don't know you out there, tell us a little bit about yourself and your career thus far and what led you to cannabis, and we'll kind of see how things shake out from there.
Yeah, well, you know, I've always been interested in art and design, which is a big part of my life. I was a former professional skateboarder when I was younger. So skateboarding, art, design, lifestyle has always been something that I've been around. Having graduated Parsons School of Design in New York, I opened up an art gallery, design gallery in the East Village of Manhattan for many years, for 10 years. So again, sort of steeped and rooted in the street art skate scene of New York City. And then went back to school. Early 2000s, when the economy fell apart, I closed my gallery because nobody was buying art or design, and went back, got my MBA, came out, was recruited over to American Express. They made me an offer I couldn't refuse. And that's what happens when you have big student loans. And worked for American Express, MasterCard, Pepsi, and then moved from New York to Microsoft in 2006 when they were launching Zune, which was an MP3 player. And just side note, we launched the MP3 player, which was competing against the iPod in 2006. And in 2007 is when the iPhone came out and the game totally changed. So it's pretty incredible, you know, the 15 years when we think about technology and what's taking place. But
absolutely,
in the forefront of art, design, skating, music and lifestyle at Microsoft with Zune, then moving into Xbox. I've just been around and sort of around culture and lifestyle for quite some time, which includes cannabis. And in 2012, when the I-502 law passed here in Washington State, that's when I decided to leave Microsoft. I saw all my friends leaving Starbucks, Amazon, Microsoft to get into the legal cannabis industry. Washington and Colorado were the first two states to have adult use cannabis. So lots of the daring folk left the big companies and jumped into the industry. So now I've been in the industry, I guess, almost 12 years, coming up on 12 years. And during that time, I worked at Dope Magazine, where I was the vice president of brand partnerships and licensing. So from there, I met everybody in the industry, really. From my previous life, I'm also a certified brand licensing specialist. So as I started to see the cannabis landscape open up and get into, as brands started to grow from state to state, I was able to help them with my real world brand licensing experience and my understanding of cannabis, and sort of bridge that gap for many. So I've been able to do that, and then for another 4 years worked at Evergreen Herbal, which is the #1 processor in Washington State, where we created a number of best-selling brands, including edibles, beverages, flower products, so on and so forth. And then finally released my book a year and a half ago, and Branding Bud, the Commercialization of Cannabis, the first book on cannabis branding, which has gone for 9 months now on Amazon in 2 categories as the best-selling book. And I say that not sort of touting my book, but I say that in a way that now is the time. Things are really happening now, and people are really interested. So for my little book to go to #1 in 2 categories really talks about the people that are purchasing books and looking for information about cannabis and cannabis branding and the evolving landscape of cannabis.
Oh, 100%. But no, I mean, congratulations. I mean, obviously, Phil, it sounds like you've really sort of hit the zeitgeist, but it sounds like you have a kind of tradition of sort of being sort of on trend with a lot of stuff. And it's kind of interesting that you sort of segued into cannabis from some other kind of, I guess, high growth industries. But I mean, do you feel like, I always say that my perception of the cannabis sector is it's almost like, number of different sectors sort of coming together, sort of almost like smashing into each other and going, okay, what the hell do we do now? How do we build from this? What can we take? Do you feel like that's, what's your perception on that? Do you feel like that's a kind of, do you see elements? Because I always see elements of kind of like, alcohol, there's pharma, there's kind of like CPG, even tech to some extent. What do you think to that? Do you think there's some truth in that, or do you see it kind of slightly differently?
Oh, well, I mean, it is a mashup of things, but it's almost like traveling to an exotic place and tasting an exotic fruit for the first time and saying, well, it's a cross between a strawberry and a banana, or something like that, right? So yeah, there are similar but different elements to it. But at the end of the day, I mean, business is business to a certain degree, but there are more hoops to jump through, certainly when it comes to cannabis.
And it's kind of like that kind of legislative sort of background. I mean, obviously you're sort of working with brands in, well, predominantly, I'm guessing in a sort of number of different states. And in terms of the sort of challenges they face in sort of building, a brand, what sort of challenges are they facing, and how have you helped them to kind of overcome them, or how are they kind of actively thinking about ways? I mean, for example, if you're a producer and you want to license a brand across states, you have, I guess the practical challenge of that is you have to actually grow it in another state. And, California cannabis grows differently from Ohio cannabis, for example. But, there's that kind of brand promise, which a lot of companies are so hot on, that you have to be able to sort of guarantee there's a sort of, similarity in quality. And I guess the question is, how hard or easy is that to do in the current kind of regulatory kind of landscape in the US?
Well, it's very hard, right? It's very difficult to do. So you just brought up a number of Wonderful.
It's about 15 questions in one. Sorry.
It's totally perfect. I mean, you set me up for all the things I want to speak about. So let's start off with a brand, right? So a brand is a promise and the ability to consistently deliver on whatever that promise is. It could be a high promise, it could be a low promise, it could be a value brand, it could be a luxury brand. But as long as you're consistently delivering, that's what people want. And that's delivering on, on either real or perceived, things as well. I mean, if people perceive something as a luxury brand because their friends do or their communities do, then it is a luxury brand, right? So, so that said, that's where we are with brands. Now, when you also think about brands, if a brand is going to be considered important and grow across communities or across cultures or across continents, we get to a place where we're talking about scale. And the cannabis industry is really built not for scale, right? You have to stay within your state. While there are ways to jump out of your state and to take your brand, there's a couple of ways, right? Either you start again, afresh, anew in another state, which isn't as easy because there's lots of, as you think, because there's lots of rules. Well, one, it's expensive. Secondly, there are lots of rules which say you have to, live in the state or be a state resident to even get into the industry. So there's lots of things that could preclude you or prevent you from doing it all on your own. And primarily it's money, because you're setting up parallel processes and parallel shops, manufacturing facilities in multiple states. So what you typically do is you license. And when you license to another company that has a manufacturing license within a state, you have to look at what they're manufacturing, right? Because they might be competing with you. If they're the number one pre-roll company and you want to be the number one pre-roll company, they might not be the match. But if they're the number one pre-roll company and you're happy to roll in right under number one and be number two, then you could roll right in with their distribution. That said, they're probably not looking for the number two because that's going to cut into there and cannibalize their line. So they might be looking for a value line that does pre-rolls where they could come in with their top line. Mm-hmm. But what also offsets that is usually when it's a licensing deal, because there's a royalty, that product has to be top of the line because you need to ask for more money to cover the royalties. So, there's lots of little nuances of do these products fit in the market? That's number one. Is there room in the market? Who's going to manufacture them, sell them, and distribute them? Are they going to cannibalize or compete with those other people in the market? So you might want to look for the edibles manufacturer if you're the pre-roll company, but the edibles manufacturer's core competency is not rolling pre-rolls, it's making edibles, right? So there's a lot of give and take, there's a lot of, push and pull, and there's a lot of trouble in that world because, people are quick to, I always talk about it this way. People are quick to get married, but they don't think about they're quick to have a wedding, but they don't think about the marriage, right? So, hey, we signed a deal in a new state. We're growing our brand. They tell their investors, but they're not thinking about the long-term relationship, about managing SOPs, standard operating procedures for their brand and what their consumers are looking for when it comes back full circle to that promise. Did they offer me what they said? And not only that, there are rules and regulations that prevent that or can prevent that. A quick note here. In Washington state, a serving size is 10 megs of THC. In Massachusetts, it's 5 megs. So you can already see Washington state is twice as much. When you get to New Mexico, it's 50 megs. Wow, that's 10 times the amount of THC you could have in a serving size between Massachusetts and New Mexico. That's crazy. So, and I could run around the rest of the states.
No, but but absolutely. It's interesting that, again, I guess it comes down to the lack of federal consistency on legalization because, there are these wildly differing, criteria.
Absolutely. And that comes down to not only the serving side or the dosing, it comes down to the packaging. So you might need a child resistant package in one state and you don't in another state. Now, I think it probably behooves every cannabis manufacturer to have some sort of packaging that makes it difficult for a child to open it up. But at the end of the day, if they don't want to and the rules don't force them to, they don't have to. But this is the problem with the fragmentation and the state by state onboarding of their own rules and regulations. And you can see it across the country. All the West Coast states, Washington, Oregon, California, have all experienced issues but have grown, and now you see it just moving eastward.
I really like the way that you speak about brand, because people think I think people hear brand or branding and it's almost this sort of ethereal idea. It's kind of out there, but in reality it's perfectly put in that it's a promise, and then everything that you do as a business to execute to deliver on that promise is part of that brand. I think that's a really key way of looking at it. It isn't this sort of higher concept. It really is actually, a pretty simple equation. So you make a promise, you say out what you're going to do for your customer and for the people involved in your business, and then you do it. And the degree to how successful your brand is both how kind of appropriate the promise is to the consumers you want to speak to, and then how well you achieve it. I think that's a really nice way of looking at it. A lot of times when we speak about marketing or brand or message, we get caught up in these kind of lofty ideas. And the reality is how good a job you do directly impacts and is going to be the biggest thing that affects your brand in any situation. And the idea that regulations and things like that are getting in the way above potentially even competitors, I think is really interesting. What are some of the things, you've worked in for some very big brands. What are some of the things maybe that cannabis as an industry or brands in cannabis can learn from the way that those bigger businesses and more established industries have kind of behaved over the years, be it in CPG, alcohol or healthcare? What are some of the things that cannabis isn't doing right that it could be doing maybe better and that it could learn from?
God, well, there's an awful lot there. How much time do we have? But I just want to jump back to one thing you just said, which you're right. Marketing and branding off, usually or can seem very lofty and sound like cerebral masturbation, basically. But that said, I do think there's a lot to branding and marketing, and you called it out as an equation. I have a presentation that I often go through, and there's an equation. And I often laugh that I call it an equation, then I call it a roadmap. But essentially, and I'll make this quick, there's a few different points or a few different pillars. If you understand who your consumer is, what their need states are, what their rituals are, what their habits are, when they consume, how they consume, you learn and understand so much more about them. So let's just take, so we're speaking cannabis right now. Let's just say, we'll use some stereotypes here. Let's say they're a soccer mom. They have kids running around the house all day or with them. They have to consume discreetly, right? So the first thing is, are they a discrete consumer or a non-discrete consumer? If they're a non-discrete consumer, they could use anything, including flower. If they have to be discreet and they're not going to smoke or smell like cannabis, then they have to use other form factors. And so once you get into those other form factors, sublingual slips, vaping, transdermal patches, tinctures, edibles, beverages, I could keep going. Then from there you get into dosing. And what is it that they're looking to benefit from or to alleviate, right? So there I break it down and it's really bifurcated. There's additive and subtractive. So if it's additive, are you consuming cannabis because you're about to go take a hike, you're about to play music, you're about to paint, you're about to have sex, whatever it is that you might consume cannabis to enhance your experience. Conversely, there's subtractive. I look at that as somebody who needs to go to sleep. Somebody has some back pain or pain or fibromyalgia, something that they want to alleviate. The mindset of hey, I want to be I want to have this moment enhanced versus the mindset of I have back pain or I need to go to sleep right now is totally different. So once you understand how they consume, when they consume, where they consume, the mind state with which they consume, you get into the form factor. And then the form factor really leads you into dosing. And then once you figure out the dosing, you really come to the final outer layer, which is what I call the brand archetype, which is all of the wrapping. It's everything from the color, the ink, the paper or the packaging, the fonts, the foils, all of those things that really make it what a brand is, a visual brand is. But outside of that, you have all this stuff that's leading up to it that really informs what this product is based on who the consumer is. And so, when you've done it a few times and you know how to do it, and you've done it at big, large companies where, those activities are funded, it's pretty amazing what you learn and what you can see. In the cannabis realm, for the most part, people either say, "Hey, it's for everybody," or more importantly, what I hear time and time again, excuse me, is cannabis sells itself, and it doesn't. It did, but it doesn't. And what I often talk about with cultivators, just quickly here, is they'll say, "Well, I've never had a problem. Back in the day, people would buy whatever I showed up with," and then a little bit later, you had a choice between, so yeah, you took whatever your dealer.
Yeah, the choice, yeah.
Then it became, do you want the brown stuff or the green stuff? And it was like, ooh, there's a choice. Well, in our world today, or at least in my world today, here in Seattle, Washington, and some of the other states, there is choice, and there are adult use cannabis stores all over, and you drive past them just like you drive past a Starbucks or a McDonald's. And so when you have choice, when you have convenience, when you have multiple brands with multiple strains, all of a sudden branding is important. And so it really comes back to, simply put, supply and demand. If there's more supply, with more choices, then the brands need to step up. If there's only one dealer showing up with one bag of weed, people are going to fight for it. And so it's simple economics, and we're seeing that take place in our industry too. But that's fine, because we're consumers of brands. That's what we've been trained to do, and I don't see why cannabis should be any different.
I think that's beautifully put. And I think particularly if you've ever worked in marketing, then the phrase "it's for everyone" is almost like that's the bingo thing, isn't it? You speak to someone about it's obviously a very niche product in any sector, and they say, no, our customer is anyone, man, woman, child, it doesn't matter, any age. And you'll think, no, that's not how it works, unfortunately. While it might sell itself when it's on its own, when it's in a room with a lot of noise, you need to be able to stand out and speak to the people that you should be speaking to and that your product is really for. And I think, that's a really, really key point when it comes to, I suppose, product ultimately, and it needs to inform brand. Yeah, completely. That's beautifully put. Very, very, very nicely.
I was going to say, one of the things we had once we spoke to someone about, there was a blockchain project someone was talking to us about, and we're like, who's your target audience? And I said, a 3-year-old Venezuelan orphan. I'm like, okay, where do we go with that? And I get it what they're trying to do, but again, it's kind of the intention versus who's the influencer versus, it's all about leaning into the customer, isn't it? And I think that's what you've highlighted there. But I kind of want to ask a potentially awkward question as well. We're talking around, you put it well when you were talking around, what are people looking to do? Is it additive, subtractive? And that made me think around the sort of distinction between, medical and recreational use. Now, from a sort of brand perspective, how do companies, if we're talking essentially about the same cultivar, the same product, and that for me presents a quandary, because I guess doctors or healthcare professionals don't want to be prescribing something that sounds like, ghost train haze, but they do. So how do you kind of bridge that gap between this is therapeutic, this is medicinal, this is recreational? How do you come at that from a branding perspective? And again, putting you on the spot a little bit, but I have a feeling you can handle that kind of question.
Yeah, this reminds me of two things. I taught a graduate level course at Parsons School of Design, and it was on design ethics. And the final project was to create 2 cannabis brands with the same cultivar, same strain in the jar, but one was an adult use or recreational product, and one was a medical product. And I wanted them to call out the benefits, and then the idea was, obviously to call out the truth of what the benefits were, but one for a medical patient, one for a recreational patient, adult use patient. Here I use the word recreational to sort of emphasize the difference and the contrast between the two. So it was interesting, and then the conversation around that is this ethical? We actually have the same thing in the same jar, but we're selling it in different ways. Isn't that intriguing? But you bring up something, Dave, which is something that I kind of learned early on was really a mine in the minefield, which is people. And again, I'm speaking primarily in the U.S. I know things are different over the world. So in the U.S., people have fought long and hard for what they call medical marijuana, and from my perspective, and again, maybe it's not a popular perspective, but from my perspective, medical marijuana should be prescribed by doctors. You can go to a pharmacy and purchase it, with a prescription, and then your insurance company should cover it. And our system isn't really there yet, so in my opinion, I almost feel like we should call it therapeutic marijuana, although I know, medical marijuana has more of a rhyme to it. The alliteration.
About the brand, yeah, it's all about branding.
That's right. The alliteration sounds wonderful, medical marijuana, more than therapeutic. But anyway, at the end of the day, we're not quite there. Doctors are not willing to put their name on it or sign a prescription. They can, but that sort of stuff. It's just not there yet. So until we have testing, until we have, and I hate to say this, but it's true. Until we have regulation, we will not have real testing. Until we don't have real testing, we won't have, again, normalization. And without normalization, we won't have the acceptance. I fear in many ways that will roll out through the pharma companies and the tobacco companies and maybe even the alcohol companies. But at the end of the day, for the plant to be normalized, whether that's literally to go into an adult use store and purchase flower, or to walk into Walgreens or in your world Boots, I think, and purchase toothpaste with a cannabinoid in it. Doesn't get you stoned, doesn't get you high, but it nourishes your gums or nourishes your teeth or something else like that. Instead of, I don't know, baby powder or talcum powder, maybe it's hemp powder. Who knows? But I do see a world in which cannabis is both cannabis as well as an ingredient in other non-cannabis products that have nothing to do with non-cannabis or that have everything to do with non-cannabis brands. So let's say Crest, Crest toothpaste. Mm-hmm. I don't know, 10, 20 years from now, I wouldn't be surprised if Crest toothpaste has a cannabinoid version in it, or an oral mouthwash, and I'm just, this could be Q-tips for your ears that instead of their cotton, they're hemp. I mean, it will both be an industry, but it will also be an ingredient, and it just won't be. Hopefully, it won't be as thought of, as what it is today, which is an industry, and it's even weird to call it an industry. I mean, think about, I don't know, is the steel industry, or does steel break up into automotive and shipping and all these other things, and it's just part of.
Yeah, I suppose it depends which point of the supply chain you're at, really, doesn't it?
Yes.
But No. But it's true. It's an interesting, because we used to always talk here British Steel, the steel industry, and Sharon. It's like, well, what does that really mean? Yeah, but it could mean a variety of different things. But I guess it's, again, it's what point you're coming into, and I suppose for a lot of cultivators and growers and things like that, they're very much. Well, again, they'll have their own specific things that they're doing, won't they? I mean, that's my understanding anyway. Like they're growing for recreational use. They're not or they're growing industrial hemp or whatever, or they're kind of, you know what I mean? So I guess, but again, it's kind of knowing those things early on. Sorry.
No, I was going to say, and one thing which we spoke about earlier too, just relative to brand. Do you know that if you look at the U.S., if you took 10 different cities in the U.S. and looked at the cultivars or strains that they preferred, there's no uniformity. The uniformity actually is that in the warmer climates, sativa is consumed more, if we could break it down that way, and in the colder climates and during the winter months, indica is consumed more. So there is geographic discrepancy, but so it would be hard. What I'm saying is, if you came in with brand X and you were looking to have the same consistency, so let's just say Marlboro cigarettes for a really bad example, but or Coca-Cola, with the exception of Mexican Coke, right? But that it's the same everywhere. And in cannabis, I almost feel like a brand that was the same everywhere probably wouldn't succeed.
I mean, could it be the same everywhere if it was kind of like an extract or something like that? If it was a cartridge, could that be pretty much the same, I guess, in the same way that I guess the Coca-Cola recipe or whatever is, homogeneous and... Sure.
Yeah. I just don't think we're there yet.
Yeah.
This is all about scale, and we're just not scaling. So it's very... appellational or it's all about the terroir, or it's all about these other things that are just very, which will go away over time. I mean, even look now, even the wine industry, right? There's these wine blends, which are like the biggest selling wines right now, and they're that way because it's just easier to make it homogeneous and to create something similar over time. And, there's give and take. There's more tolerance, right? Whereas, like, if you're waiting for one grape in one vineyard to pop, it may or may not, But that's why you have hundreds or $1,000 bottles of wine, because there's those fluctuations.
Oh, Jeremy, are you? I think I can't hear your sound for a minute.
Sorry, sir.
That's right.
Homogenous is good for very big business. And at the moment, in the way that certainly in the US it's structured, it isn't possible for brands to execute in that way for all the reasons that you've spoken about, because product is grown in different places and is, dried in different places, is stored in different places in different climates. And as much as you try to control it, there is going to be variance. So it's almost at this point, a lot of people talk about big brands coming in and buying up, and there's this point of consolidation, which a lot of people are quite negative about. And there's obviously good reason for that, because it does push smaller players out. But equally, the legislation that is in so many ways tying one hand behind the backs of MSOs is also in some ways protecting smaller businesses, because they're not able to operate at scale. They're not able to create a homogenous product. And I think that's even an interesting dichotomy to think about on its own. But yeah, probably a discussion for a different day.
Yeah, I've seen different cannabis companies approach it differently. Some have sort of capped out in their state and now feel they want to move on to other states to create more revenue. Others have also capped out in the state. But I have a friend, and she has 2 great brands. She has 20 some odd people working for her, and she's got a $20+ million a year business. And she said, why do I need to go start in another state and yell at other operators that don't love my product as much as I do and don't, love my brand as much as I do? So she's sitting back. So there are people, on both sides of the fence. We have to grow a national brand so we can be purchased and be recognized and acquired. And then there's other people that are just sitting back and saying, I've got 10 more years of some pretty amazing stuff. And again, my friend, she, in her wildest dreams, never thought she'd own a cannabis company, let alone a multi-million-dollar cannabis company. So she's happy and she's cruising, so it just depends. But there's, and it also depends on what state you're in too. There's lots, again, it's so fragmented and so different. If you're in California, it's pretty tough right now. It's pretty tough everywhere, but it's just different everywhere too.
Yeah, absolutely. And on that note, thinking around sort of international expansion and, as kind of European predominantly at the moment, markets are opening up. I mean, we've been at sort of shows where there's a lot of people from North America, and it's kind of clear that they're sort of waiting with bated breath to see what their opportunities will be. But I guess in terms of, scaling a brand, a US or Canadian brand, arguably you're the most mature markets. What? I mean, it's not as simple. Is it as simple as sort of taking the sort of brand, sort of, hey, we're in Germany now. Oh, we're in the Czech Republic. Do that present similar opportunities in the way that you think a lot of companies think about it, or are they, again, jury's out because it's a kind of unknown quantity? But I guess based on what you've seen so far in terms of how brands starting in one state have licensed their brand and moved to another state and become an MSO, etc. Do you think there's going to be similar movement internationally as well as more markets become adult use?
Yes and no.
Okay.
So it's an interesting question. So I would answer with a question, forgive me, which is, we're talking about brands, we're talking about cannabis brands, but are we actually talking about cannabis products? Because Cookies is a perfect example of how they've gone from not only state to state selling cannabis, but they've gone from skate shop to skate shop, if you will, or country to country, if you will, selling hats, hoodies, and merch. So, they just opened up a 5-story building in Times Square, of which there will be a 21 plus floor when the time is right and when they can get their license in New York. So I guess my first question is like, what is a cannabis brand, right? Is it a lifestyle brand or is it really a cannabis brand? Cookies is a great example. There's another company called Califari, which is all about art in cannabis, but they have artwork for every cultivar they sell. So they do NFTs, they have a line of apparel, they do all these they have a line of skateboard decks, right? So again, it's lifestyle, it's graphics, it's imagery, it's everything that a lifestyle brand is. So my answer for you is, one, what is a cannabis brand and how then do they enter? Well, in Cookie's case, they've built a multi-million-dollar apparel business, and that's gone from, the cool kids here in the US all the way over to Europe. I mean, when I was at Spanibus right before the pandemic, I mean, it was only the cool kids that had the Cookies hoodies, but now if I went over to Spanibus, I'm sure everybody would have a Cookies hoodie. So we see brands coming into markets prior to selling cannabis, right? And I think that's huge, and that's a clue. But again, you have to create something that generates the buzz around that in order to do that. So that's number one. Number two is, that second phase of the strategy is, okay, when can we actually sell product in a new state, in a new country, so on and so forth. The thing that I found in Europe, and in Spain in particular, was, everybody's all about the genetics. I've brought a number of different brands to Europe, American brands to Europe. People were interested for a minute, and then they were like, but what about the next strain and the next strain and the next strain? And to be honest with you, that's a really hard game to play, is keeping up with with the cultivars and the strains because it just is. It's not a great business to be in, but it certainly is a fun and interesting, thing to follow and watch. So, what I've seen at the end of the day, the successful brands here are the ones that have specific cuts or cultivars, and they become known for it, and then that's what they sell. So it's almost like a perfume. It's their fragrance, and you really want theirs. And even though other people might have a similar recipe, you really want theirs.
No, it's a tricky one, isn't it? And again, it reminds me of that kind of Trojan horse sort of approach that people talk about. Oh, we're coming in under the facade of medical marijuana, but really it's kind of recreational that people are sort of pushing for. But kind of like one will lead to the other. But again, for me, it's a very smart tactic, I think. But again, it's almost like establishing that lifestyle brand. It has to be. Is that harder to establish than a cannabis brand? Do you know what I mean? Or is it the kind of implied connection with cannabis? In the case of cookies, the whole kind of scene, Burno with his rap scene, and the culture around that has kind of fed into the sort of the brand itself and what it offers. It offers a kind of it's a kind of it's a zeitgeist, for want of a better term, isn't it? And it's it works, but sort of building the building blocks of that, it's almost like cannabis is inherent, but almost you can operate without articulating that. And I think that's the kind of interesting spot to be in. Yeah,
it is, but it also, I think it comes back down to who's your customer, who's the consumer. I saw something a couple of weeks ago, actually, on LinkedIn, where a middle-aged woman chimed in and said, because the conversation was about how Burner won a Lifetime Achievement Award, and she chimed in and said, he's like only in his 30s. How could he get a Lifetime Achievement Award? And by the way, who cares about cookies, bro? And that was her question mark, right? And of course, she doesn't. She couldn't care less about cookies. It's just not in her world. I was just talking over the weekend with a friend, one of my friends who started Zoo York, which was a New York City skate brand. And we were talking about Supreme, and which started around the same time. But could Supreme actually happen again, right? It's the zeitgeist. It's this moment in time where it's like hip hop in New York. It's like it's like when I owned my art gallery in the 80s in the Lower East Side, and Keith Haring and Jean-Michel Basquiat, and all these characters around, and there was just something happening. And what's interesting is, side note, when I went back to New York over the summer, and I spent like 3 nights out till 4 a.m. in the morning going to these cannabis speakeasies, I said to my best friend and partner of my gallery back in the day, I said, it's been decades since I went out till 4 a.m. in New York City, especially 3 nights in a row. But there were so many places to go, and there was so much energy around these cannabis speakeasies. And it reminded me of the late 80s in New York City. So again, I think it's happening now on the East Coast. It's happening for sure in a different way on the West Coast, but it's happening now in speakeasies in New York. And there's an energy now that people are starting to tap into and people are starting to recognize. And there will be brands those New York brands that come out of what's going on now. But because we're in the middle of it, it's so hard to, coming out of those speakeasies was almost how I felt coming out of Studio 54 back in the day, where it was just, that really dates me. But it was just like, wow, something's going on there, and you don't quite recognize it until, you can say, did you see that? Until it's sort of in your rear view mirror. But it's going on right now.
That's it. And I guess in some ways, a lot of the stuff that's kind of still current now is, it never went away. It's always kind of been there, but it's almost like there needs to be that kind of cultural influence that sort of tips things over the edge and has that broader adoption, and is figuring out what that is. And it's not an easy thing to figure out. And I guess if it was easy, we'd all be doing it, right? So, it's good. But no, I think this has been fascinating. So thank you so much for your time, David. I really, really appreciate it. I think we could probably riff on just random anecdotes about Studio 54 for hours, but we'll have to do that offline, I think. And next time we meet, for sure, I want to hear about Basquiat and all of that, all the good stuff in the art world. That'd be amazing. But no, thank you so much. And any other final points before we sort of sign off? I mean, I know you're doing lots of podcasts. You're doing a few sort of live sessions as well on LinkedIn right now, aren't you?
I am every Thursday at 11 a.m. PST and 1 p.m. EST. We do a podcast, a LinkedIn live stream, where we bring industry influencers on and we chat about really what's going on. So it's never a dull moment over here. But yeah, and it never changes, so you could speak to the same person a month later and something else is different, happening in a different part of the country. But it's quite intriguing, and I can't wait for it to start happening globally. I know it's starting in Europe. They're picking up in Thailand. There's lots going on. So hopefully we have momentum.
Very good. We'll watch this space, everybody. But thanks, David, and we'll see you again soon.
Thanks, David.
Thank you, James. Thank you, Jamie. I appreciate it.